Roaming around in the middle of nowhere can be fun, exploring long-forgotten places and perhaps uncovering some long-lost treasure. However, if something goes wrong, and with no one around, things can go south quite quickly. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Number 1. This happened to my grandparents. My grandparents were born in Mexico, late 20s and early 30s, and this story took place in the mid-40s. They had moved into a super small town in the mountains of Jalisco. I've been to it once when I was smaller. It was fairly beautiful, and everyone there was super nice, except for when you would mention who they called La Señora. Basically, the story as my grandmother told it is that she and my grandfather had been living there for about 2 or 3 months and had began to get familiarized with how the town functioned. The town was fairly normal, except for the fact that at night, no one went outside. One night, they decided to go to a newly made friend's house on the other side of town. After staying late into the night, they decided it was best for them to walk back to their house. Their friend advised them that it would be the best thing to do if they stayed the night, because he didn't want them to be scared if they came across something. To which they asked what exactly it was that he was talking about. They explained that the town is haunted by a woman dressed in black Victorian-esque clothing that is usually spotted around the center plaza during the dead of night. The locals have no actual name for her other than La Señora, or whatever random name they called her in order to try and quell the fears and downplay her existence. Despite the friend's request to have them spend the night there, they decided to walk back, as it wouldn't take them any more than 10 minutes to reach their house. They weren't superstitious by any means, and just shrugged it off. They left the friend's house around 3 a.m. and began making their way back to their house, when they saw her, a woman dressed in all black, standing near a lamppost in the town plaza. My grandma remembers the air becoming fairly cold, and a sense of despair filling every inch of her as they got closer and closer to this thing. My grandpa proceeds to grab my grandma tight as they got within 8 feet of the woman. The roads in the town are extremely narrow, so you don't have much room to go around people. My grandma went on to tell me how the lady wasn't actually standing on the ground, but rather floating a few inches off the ground. Her face was fairly hard to make out at first, but as they passed her and got within arm's reach, her face became as clear as day. It was pale, expressionless, and looked as if she had been drowned. But the scariest part of all were that her eyes were just empty, black sockets. My grandparents quickly put it into high gear and ran to their house, but not without taking a look back to see where the lady had gone. To their surprise, she had disappeared. Cliché as hell, but what they say happened in the story. The next day they saw their friend and told them what happened, to which he instructed them to never speak of it again. My grandparents have told me this story about 10 or more times, and each time they recounted it, my grandmother would begin to cry, and my grandfather's face would fill with fear. I'm more inclined to believe their story more than anyone else's, simply because of their reaction. and the look of pure horror on their faces when they remember this dreadful night. Number 2. I lived out in the boonies, so there were only a handful of houses near me, and I never really saw anyone. Every day when I was around 12, I would walk out in random directions through the forest, just for something to do. One day I walked off the main road, onto a dirt road a few miles away, and at the very end, I found an abandoned house. Not unusual for the area, so I just looked around for a bit, but there was nothing too interesting. Behind the house, I noticed an old trail that went into another forest, so I followed it. I went down around 2 miles, and it brought me to an abandoned summer camp. Now this was interesting. When I looked around the place though, there were little signs that people were still there. Small animal traps set out, piles of clothing, garbage and food. This freaked me out a lot, because I was pretty stupid, so I kept looking around. Not long after, 3 men emerged from one of the buildings. They were dirty, unshaven, and were very, very large. The moment I saw them, I started sprinting away. I left my bag and everything on the ground. I got to a clearing and stopped to catch my breath. I looked behind me to see if I was safe, and I wasn't. They came into the clearing attempting to run after me. I was being followed. I continued sprinting until I got back to the abandoned house, and I couldn't run anymore. So I went into the basement and hid inside a cupboard, crying at this point silently. I heard them talking outside the house and walking around. Fortunately for me, the building was so old, the floors could barely hold me at 90 pounds, let alone those gigantic men, so they couldn't go in, and they knew it. Eventually it all fell silent, but I stayed in there a lot longer just in case. By the time I came outside, the sun was setting, and they were well and truly gone. When I got back home, my parents freaked out, since I was gone for a very, very long time. I just burst into tears and told them the whole story. My father couldn't believe that I went so far away, and told me that a band of hicks are notorious for committing petty crimes in the area, and they lived only a mile away from that camp apparently. After learning everything, I was pretty deterred from going out there for a while. I can't imagine what might have happened if they caught me, and I'm quite sure they weren't just eagerly trying to return my backpack. Number 3. I was in Japan visiting a small town called Ohito back in 2010. I went to an onsen, which is sort of like a spa with natural hot springs, that abutted a small mountain. After spending some time relaxing at the onsen, I decided to hike the small mountain behind it. As I approached, I noticed a strange structure at the foot. It was a large tiered rock that had some small openings on each level, going into the side of the mountain. The rock was cracked, missing or falling apart, with much vegetation and overgrowth. Whatever the structure was, it had not been used for some time. The scale of it was such that it would have been too large for me to climb. So I went to one of the sides, and there I found a footpath up the mountain. It wasn't a very long hike, perhaps 30 minutes. I think I started the hike in the afternoon, maybe somewhere around 3 p.m. And it was a beautiful sunny day. I didn't see or hear anything along the hike. When I reached the top, I found a lookout point that overlooked the onsen and the town. It was a pristinely beautiful view. The trail continued on from the lookout, so I followed a little further upwards and eventually came to an entryway to a very small temple. There were some statues and things that you typically find at temples. The entryway had a gate, which is like what you see in movies or whatever. The two pillars holding up a bowed piece at the top. As I walked through the gateway, the air became very still and everything went silent. There was absolutely no ambient noise, and I continued towards the temple, observing the statues and things along the way. I didn't go inside because I heard that nobody is really supposed to go in, so out of respect, I stayed out. So I just walked around the perimeter. When I came around to the back, I started to hear some kind of low-pitched chanting. My hair stood on end, and it freaked me the hell out at first. I just stood there for a moment until I calmed down. It sounded like it was coming from the other side of the shrine. But I was just there, and it was so quiet I'm sure that there was nobody else around. I was still a bit on edge, so I peered around the corner, and what I saw was 8 Japanese men dressed in traditional garments and robes, but their faces looked old, incredibly wrinkled, so wrinkled that I could barely make out features like eyes, nose, or a mouth. Some of them were carrying something that looked like rocks, but they would flicker and shimmer gold when the sun hit them. They were walking down the path from the gateway towards the temple, chanting. It was so strange. I didn't approach them because I feared that they would be upset or angry that a foreigner was trespassing on their holy ground. So I stayed behind the temple until I didn't hear the chanting anymore. Once the chanting stopped, I peered back around the corner. Probably no more than 2 minutes had gone by since the chanting had finished. It felt like an eternity. I didn't see them, but I thought they might just be silently huddled around the very front of the temple, out of my current line of sight. So I crept off into the woods and slowly made my way around the perimeter until the front of the temple was in my line of sight. This probably took no more than a minute. There was nobody there. I was pretty well creeped out at this point, so I hastily made my way back down the mountain. The temple wasn't very big, and I doubt all of them could have fit in there, and the path ended there, so I have absolutely no clue who they were or where they could have gone. I didn't tell anyone in my group what I saw, because I didn't know anyone very well, and just thought that they wouldn't believe me, or simply wouldn't care. Number 4. My then boyfriend, now husband, and I were camping at Harriet Lake, which is a very small lake, pretty deep in the Willamette National Forest. We were on a road trip from San Francisco to Vancouver and decided to spend one of the days exploring Portland for the first time, since our campsite was only around 90 minutes outside of the town. On our way back from the campsite, we approached the last stoplight in the last town, Estacada, Oregon, before the highway narrowed to 1 lane in each direction. At the red light, we were pulled up next to a couple on a motorcycle. They looked to be in their 50s. The man in the front was short and pudgy, whilst the woman in the back was tall and lanky. I joked to my husband that they looked like Boris and Natasha from the Rocky and Bullwinkle show. When the light turned green, they looked over at us, took off, and cut in front of us. They disappeared pretty quickly down the curvy road ahead, and I remember us thinking that we had somehow pissed them off, because they were driving very aggressively. So, soon after, we found ourselves deep in the forest. The winding road was flanked by cliffs on the left, and the sparkling, rushing Clackamas River on the right. Several small, old green metal bridges passed over the winding river. Cell signals quickly disappeared, and the sun was setting. There were very few people around, except for a few fishermen, trying to get one last catch before the sun went down for the night. As we approached the last bridge before the turnoff that led to the campground, we noticed that Boris and Natasha were parked sideways in the middle of the bridge. As we got closer to them, we realized that they were staring at us, almost as if they were waiting for us, and I noticed that Natasha was holding something in her hand. Whatever it was producing a fair amount of smoke. I thought maybe we had come across them smoking a cigar or a blunt or something. As we slowed down and prepared to pass them on the bridge, I got a closer look at whatever was in her hand, and realized that there was way too much smoke coming from it. Right as we were passing them, she tossed the smoking object under the car, and they scooted off the bridge, then turned around and looked at us as if they were waiting for something to happen. My husband had the quick thinking to swerve and accelerate out the way, and not a moment too soon, the object exploded forcefully right after our car had cleared it. Boris and Natasha, having failed to accomplish whatever their goal was, either to disable our car and rob us, kidnap us, or even kill us, sped off down the road. My husband was understandably furious, and so was I. We were both totally freaked out. I was convinced that they were following us, or had been following us earlier that day, and I was 100% certain that they would return to our campsite in the night, where we were defenseless in our tents, either to finish the job or to get rid of the witnesses. Fortunately for us though, we never saw them again. Number 5. I was in a small bush plane a while ago for a pretty routine and recreational flight. A longer one. We flew way out of radio range of anything, and there was nothing on the radio at all. Not on any channel. Good weather, but nobody in the air or on the ground in the area, due to how remote and difficult it was to get to, and due to it being a small area population-wise as well. Very few people had a plane, and therefore, it never happened that two people with planes were in the same area at once. This is because every pilot knew each other, and we always discussed our flight plans for the future. Completely alone, myself and the pilot, and even though there was the roar of the engine, it was pretty peaceful. The landscape was breathtaking below us, and the sun shone beautifully off the trees. Bored, I scrolled the radio channels receiving only static or nothing, and then it happened. The radio cut out and shut off. Not like no audio, like off, no power, dead. Unsettling as it was, I chalked it up to equipment failure and turned back to the sky. After around 10 seconds, the radio powers on, After around 10 seconds, the radio powers on by itself, and at full volume, in the scariest and raspiest voice you can imagine, a woman screams, "Help me," and then the radio powers off. That shit was as clear as day. The damn sending radio might as well have been in the back seat of the plane. That's how well the signal was picked up. Not a spit of static. Freaked out, I looked at the pilot and said, "What the hell was that?" And he said, "Dude, I have absolutely no idea. Check the radio." We were simultaneously scanning the ground for signs of life. The signal must have originated somewhere close. So I begin to examine the radio, turn the dial off and on. It powers up and goes back to what it was before, picking up very staticky signals from another pilot further off. A few minutes later, those signals sound a bit better, and my pilot radios the other and asks about the transmission we heard. Apparently they heard nothing. Later that week, the pilots went for beers, and my pilot that day asked them all if they had heard something, but they all said nothing. 2 days later, a woman was found dead in the wilderness after breaking her leg whilst hiking and starving to death. She did not have a radio with her near her setup, which was close to where they think she broke her leg, as the wound would not have let her walk that well, and the terrain was poor for hiking anyway. We never did find the source, but I try not to think about that day, and I no longer fiddle with the radio anymore when I do flying. Number 6. I was in the mountains of North Carolina for several days. It was a beautiful and peaceful hiking trip with my brother, sister, and their friend Caleb. Being from the Midwest, we had survived 2 tornadoes. I thought the worst weather event of my life was about to occur, and I was sleeping in a hammock. For those of you who don't know, just before a tornado is formed above your head, every animal in sight will be freaking the hell out. They know. They can feel it. You can feel it too. You just won't know what that new feeling is until the 60-year-old trees beside you are being ripped up from the ground. Being in the eye of the tornado is even more strange, as all those animals in sight are frozen. Sure, they still exist, but their little soul is on hold, and they don't do much more than just look around quietly. It's really creepy. Anyway, this wasn't a tornado at 3 AM. The fire we made was just embers, and a roaring thunder of animals freaking out. I peeked my head out of my hammock, imagining getting my face smashed in by the first softball-sized hailstone. But no, there was no bad weather. There was no storm or looming catastrophe. It was a beautiful night, aside from the roaring animal kingdom outside. My brother peeks his head out of the hammock above me and looks down to see if I'm awake. When he saw my eyes as wide as saucers, he whispered, "What the hell is happening?" I replied, "I don't know, but I wish I were up there on your hammock." Being on the ground level usually is best for guys my size. I lack the grace to climb up hammock ropes and jump into a bed 8 feet off the ground. Anyway, the terrifying, creepy roaring continued for about 30 seconds, and then it just suddenly stopped. It seemed to be a sweeping effect, where the outside of the radius stopped first and the creatures closer to us stopped last. But it was only a single second or two difference, and it was pretty damn synchronized. My brother and I freaked out, and after around 5 minutes of silence, we got out of the hammock and started the fire up again. This time, we made sure it was big enough to light a few 100 feet out. The last thing we needed is a Bigfoot or some weird shit going down. My brother went up to the ridge to check on my sister and Caleb, about 60 feet uphill from our hammocks. Caleb always wanted to be in the highest possible safe spot he could, and he wanted to watch the sunrise from his hammock. As soon as my brother got to their hammocks, he yelled a shrieking kind of yell for me, the kind I had only heard from him twice, when his friend got his handlebar lodged in his stomach about an inch deep as a kid, and when he split his own head open. I ran up the ridge with my axe in my right hand and the first aid bag in my left, with my flashlight in my teeth, expecting the worst. I arrived to Caleb's bottom bunk. He was in a state of shock, his eyes wide open. He was shivering and shaking, and he was staring down at the valley. Would you know, my sister didn't even wake up? Go figure. She had her headphones in all night listening to her folk music. Apparently she hates the sound of animals and prefers to have a controlled mental state where nothing can make her paranoid. We woke her up, and she had no idea what was going on. She just stayed in her hammock like, well, what do you want me to do? We eventually got Caleb down to the fire and wrapped him in some blankets. I gave him a shot of whiskey to sip on, but he mostly just held it and stared at the fire. The whole night was too weird for sleep, but Caleb finally laid down next to the fire and slept around 4:45. But then my brother spotted something strange. "What's that?" he said, pointing down at the valley. "Right there on the bank of the river." My sister and I struggled to get his perspective, but then finally noticed a clearing. We decided to go check it out, but one of us had to stay with Caleb. My sister volunteered as she hates creepy things and didn't want us to go down, but we insisted. I left her my axe and emergency GPS signal thing, and I told her to just scream if she needed us and not to hesitate to use her pepper spray. She said to stop freaking her out and just go, and that they'll be there when we get back. So my brother and I hiked down the river. It took us nearly 20 minutes, but when we arrived we felt very uncomfortable. There were no animals around. None whatsoever. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. The clearing on the riverbank was about 100 yards upstream. We took the higher side of the bank to keep our distance. I didn't think either of us would actually expect anything to go down, but we wanted to remain cautious. We were around 50 yards away, at a slight elevation to the clearing. We pulled out our phones to take a picture, but our phones were dead. Mine is known to die, but I have an external battery pack that attaches to my OtterBox that I know was fully charged. My brother's phone is always reliable and usually attached to his portable solar panel charger that he keeps on the outside of his bag. His shit was dead too. Both of us tried to hold down our power buttons, not believing that they were really dead. But when we realized that they were definitely not going to turn on, we both got that paranoid look on our faces. We decided to leave, but not before carefully studying the clearing for a few seconds. It was about 100 feet across, and the shape of a triangle. All the bushes and plants that grew alongside the river were all flattened down, and even some mature azalea bushes that typically stand between 6 and 8 feet tall were eerily laying flat. It's as if everything in that triangle shape had bent down, as close to the ground as it could get. Nothing appeared broken, but appeared as if it had grown along the earth instead of growing up towards the sun. It was weird as shit, and only in the triangle area. When we got back to camp, Caleb was awake. My sister had a weird look on her face, and Caleb was totally normal. "Hey bro, you alright?" my brother asked. Caleb just casually answered, "Yeah man, doing well. Missed the sunrise, but I guess I need the sleep." We just looked at him concerned like, what the hell? He was eating a breakfast bar and heating up coffee over the fire. We sat down across from him, and I asked him, "So, hey, do you remember that shit last night?" He looked at me puzzled. My brother added, "You know, when all the animals freaked out and we found you." He just looked so confused. But my sister said, "Caleb, stop playing." "What are you talking about?" he said. My brother chimed in, "Bro, you were messed up all night." Caleb laughed and responded, "Yeah, I figured it had to be me, because I never sleep next to the fire all wrapped up in blankets. Not after getting that bug in my ear that one time, lol." We continued to ask him questions, but he had no memory whatsoever. As far as he was concerned, he had a few too many drinks and slept next to the fire. We told him our story, and each of us agreed that he had no recollection. We told him about the spot next to the river, and how our phones wouldn't turn on. We pulled our phones out to show him, and they were already on. My brother had around 67%, and mine had around 41%. We got the creeps real quick. We decided to pack up camp and get away from that spot. But before we did a final sweep, Caleb asked, "Have you guys seen my camera?" He had a nice Sony DSLR with a nice lens, and that shit was gone. The weirdest part is that he slept with it in his hammock every single time he goes camping, and we've never seen it not on his body. He even specifically remembers taking it to bed and tucking it into its bag and putting the lens in its sleeve. It's like a ritual for him, and he takes super good care of his belongings. We searched around the ridge and all around the fire and in between the two spots. There was nothing to be found. Caleb even went down to the ridge a bit towards the river, in case it had fallen out and rolled down the hill, but it was gone. We had to leave, and my siblings and I agreed to pitch him to get him a new one if he would just get out of there. About 3 miles and 1 hour later, my brother turned to me on the trail and said, "Do you think he tried to take a picture of some shit he wasn't supposed to see?" And the creepiest feeling swept over me, and I replied, "Bro, let's just forget about how messed up he was and get the hell away from there." He nodded in agreement. It's been about a year now, and we haven't seen or heard from Caleb in over 8 months. No one has. Number 7. I live in a compound by myself. I know it sounds wacko, but it's really my tiny home, workshop, and a couple of other buildings for food, equipment and storage, and a guest room. One bad snowstorm knocked my area OOC, so I decided to hunker in for the long haul. I spent almost 2 weeks without leaving. 3 days in, I get woken up by a knock at the door. I get up to answer it, and halfway there I realize that the only way this guy could knock on my door is if he broke the lock. So I grab my shotgun and ask him through the door who he is and what he wants. The guy says nothing and keeps banging. I go out the back door and sneak around the front, and I see a man who's on the ground, covered in blood and shouting for help. Turns out he was driving and crashed and dragged himself 5 miles down the road until he came to my place. By then, he realized that I forgot to lock the bottom part of my gate and weaseled in. Luckily, he survived. Number 8. A few years ago, I moved to Fort Worth and later took a job in Lubbock, Texas. I had a wedding to attend back in Missouri, so I took a load of my stuff to my new apartment in Lubbock and then drove back to Missouri. It was a long drive, and I left the wedding reception around 6 or 7 and headed back to Lubbock because I started my new job in the morning. Between Lubbock and Wichita Falls, there is a 3.5-hour stretch of highway that is mostly ranch country. There are a few really tiny towns sprinkled in, but you can drive the whole 3.5 hours and never see a car if you do it at the right time. I happened to go through around 3 a.m. So I turn onto the highway, which runs basically straight, east-west, looking forward to the last leg of the drive, and finally, the prospect of being able to sleep. There was no one on the road. There's no reception for me once I left Wichita Falls, and until I got back to Lubbock. So, here I am driving through ranch country with no reception and nothing around, and I come to one of the first little tiny towns. On the side of the road, in the middle of a town, is a car that seems to be broken down. There is a woman standing there with the hood up and a jack nearby, but not actually being used, and she's trying to wave me down. Normally I stop and help in situations like this, but I really needed to get back and get some proper sleep for my first day. And something about it just felt wrong. As soon as I passed the car, the woman runs to the passenger side and gets in. A man springs out from hiding beside the other side of the car, slams down the hood, jumps in and starts the car. They start driving after me. It was all super hurried as soon as I didn't stop. So I did what anyone would do and pumped it up to 80-90 and hoped that there wasn't a loose cow. I could see their headlights on the highway behind me for a long time, but they eventually seemed to have given up. We hadn't come to any other town or place to turn off, so they must have turned around. I was super creeped out, but kind of forgot about it until the other day. I got in at 6 a.m. and had to be at work by 8 a.m. So the event in my mind got a little bit lost in between my power nap and first day. Number 9. I knew a guy that spent virtually his entire adult life homeless. He used to wander around all over the country and spent more than his fair share of nights sleeping in the woods with another homeless man who he befriended whilst out on the streets. One morning, he set off into the town early to fetch booze and cigarettes whilst things were still quiet and not many people were around. His buddies stayed behind in their particular spot of the forest, sleeping. These two guys weren't keen on being disturbed, so they typically went fairly deep into the woods, a good 2 or so hours walk from the town. It took him a good 4 hours to get to town, buy his stuff from the offie, and then lug it back to the spot where his friend was. When he finally returned, he found his friend burnt alive inside his charred sleeping bag. In the 4-hour window that he'd been left to get booze, his friend had been attacked while sleeping in his sleeping bag and was set aflame by someone in the middle of the woods. Number 10. I was good friends with my neighbor and his family when I was a teenager. My neighbor was a youth pastor of a local church. Apparently, someone at the church decided to go backpacking in Yosemite National Park. My neighbor had never been backpacking before, and he knew that I was an avid backpacker and hiker. So he basically begged me to go with him. I agreed and met his youth group. Jeez, what a bunch of misfits. These kids ranging from 14 to 17, and they were poorly behaved and had some bad attitudes. And one in particular bragged long and loud about how he would wrestle a bear. We hiked up the Mist Trail into Little Yosemite Valleys, which is on the backside of Half Dome. We spent the day hiking in some really nice territory. I didn't much care for my group, but the 19-year-old 5-foot female trail guide was friendly, so it wasn't a total loss. The campsite at LYV is backpacker only, so the site is basically a forested area with a few felled trees which acts as a marker for the different campsites. It was summer, and fair weather, so we didn't bring tents. Sleeping out on tarps and sleeping bags, and I was trying to bed down and go to sleep. A couple of the punks in the group thought it would be funny to lob small sticks and stones at me, and I asked them to stop, but these punks just kept laughing and kept it up. It sufficiently pissed me off, and I vowed to get even. I waited until the chatter died off, and the sounds of deep sleep breathing grew around me. The forested campground was pitch black on a new moon night, and no campfires were allowed. All quiet, all around. The only differentiation between the blackness of the surroundings was the velvety purple of the night sky, blazing with a million stars. I crept out of my sleeping bag and crawled on my hands and knees, carefully brushing the forest floor in front of me, clear of needles and twigs, which there were a lot of, so that as I moved I wouldn't make any sounds. I crawled over to the two punks who threw stones at me and found their hiking boots and tossed their boots into the bushes. Then crawled back to my sleeping bag silently and went to sleep with a grin on my face. Sleep came quickly after that. I snapped awake some time later, still pitch black inky darkness all around, and everything was completely, totally, eerily silent. I happened to be laying on my side when I awoke, and I completely, no middle groggy ground, just snapped awake from a dead sleep. I could see a narrow sliver of the velvety night sky between the trunks of trees. Right at that moment, a shadow broke the bottom edge of the silver night sky. My breathing froze, and my heartbeat ratcheted up quickly. So I lay still, totally awake, staring wide awake into the darkness, straining with all my senses, listening. Nothing. Silence. I told myself it must have been an owl gliding through the darkness on silent wings, and I closed my eyes and slowed my breathing, trying to go back to sleep. I started to doze off again, when all of a sudden, one of the backpacks in the line of backpacks that were set against the fallen marker log of our campsite began to jiggle. Well, the zippers started jiggling. I froze again, trying to figure out what the heck would be making those zippers jiggle, as no other backpack zippers were jiggling. Right then, a 19-year-old 5-foot trail guide flicks on her flashlight, 6 inches away from a brown bear's face. The bear had chomped into the backpack and was doing a full reverse tug to trying to make off with it. But the dead log had snapped limbs, and by pulling the bag it had torn the nylon hopelessly and snagged it. It took me a moment to register. There's a bear in camp, 6 feet to my left. Our trail guide starts yelling at it and hitting it in the face with small stones that she scooped off the forest floor. This woke up the whole camp pretty quickly, and someone started blowing one of those ultrasonic whistles. The bear gave up and sprinted out of camp, dodging between tents and shaking its head as if it had bees in its ears. It didn't come back, and it turns out the punks who had been throwing stones at me whilst I was trying to get to sleep left a bag of trail mix in his backpack. Dumbass. Number 11. I'm going to tell you this story my uncle told me when I was 12. I slept with the lights on for months after. This was in the mid-70s. My uncle and his friend were 13 and playing in a quarry on the outskirts of town. There were mine tracks running up the large hills that then dumped their load down onto the other side of this standard quarrying stuff, I assume. So they're climbing up and over all the large hills and notice something in a tree at the edge of the woods. They walk closer and realize it's a young boy hanging by his neck. His arms and legs were tied together behind his back, with his left leg free. He was naked and had cuts all over his genitals. There were fresh tire tracks underneath the boy's feet. He said that they heard tires spinning not long before, but they didn't think anything of it. So obviously, he can't know the whole story, but it's his guess that 2 guys raped and tortured this boy, tied him up in the back of a pickup, and tied the noose around his neck, then drove off. Chilling to think about. We were discussing this at my grandmother's funeral, and he said that he always regretted not going up to the boy to see if he was still alive. Understandably, he and his friends noped out of there immediately and called the police. Number 12. It was either late November or early December, and about 5 or 6 years ago. I was deeply religious at the time, and we were heading over to one of those living nativity things, where they have actors pretend to be the Virgin Mary, Joseph, and the wise men, etc. And they kind of put on an outdoor show. It was held at a Christian campground outside of a nearby city, and we didn't know the area very well, so we had some directions given to us. This was winter in the US, so it was already getting dark when we set out. We got to the area just fine, but had forgotten the name of the exit that we were supposed to take to actually reach the grounds. Luckily, the campgrounds had a big sign right next to an exit, so we assumed that this was the way to go. We took the road and thought nothing of it. Crisis averted. The city this campground is next to is actually quite large, and the exit we took is very close to a shopping district, so we weren't completely in the middle of nowhere, but still quite isolated. But very abrupt, this exit turned from civilization to deep woods. The exit turned from civilization to deep woods. We thought, well, it's a campground, so that's about right. And we kept driving. Pretty soon we passed a clearing on the right. The clearing was perhaps 50 feet, and then the woods again. And at every edge of the woods, we could see this huge stone gate, with wrought iron doors. It looked like a cemetery gate, but it didn't lead to a path or anything, it was just trees. Had no fence around it either, just a gate. We kept going, remarking to each other that it was kind of creepy, but still we didn't think much of it. It was starting to get foggy. At this point, it felt like maybe I should point out that despite being winter, it wasn't that cold and there was not any snow. And a while later, we came to some houses. This is where things got weird. The first house was a standard suburban house, but in the driveway, which was very short, was a van with the doors open. The hazard lights were on too. Like the car was on, but nobody was in or around it, and the house was completely dark. We were a little nervous now, wondering if perhaps something bad had happened, like an accident or something, and the driver of our car slowed down to look. Then my other friend, in the front, pointed ahead. As it turns out, all of the houses on the street were like this, on both sides of the road. Lights out, cars in the driveway, all the car doors open, with the hazard lights on. At this point we're more than a little freaked out, thinking we've driven straight into Silent Hill, or a particularly mean prank. Though it seems a little strange to do a community-wide prank in the middle of nowhere. We hadn't seen any people, mind you, and for whatever reason we continued to drive. Maybe to get out of there faster, and then there was a little bend in the road. The instant we started to go through it, this massive black dog came out of nowhere and ran full tilt at the driver's side of the car. I'm still not sure if the dog actually made contact with the car, but if not, it came incredibly close. After charging at us, it had no intention of retreating. It stayed in the road, barking its head off. Our driver did a quick U-turn, and we got out of there as fast as possible. Ditched the nativity thing, and never tried to go back. We found out when we got home and spoke to the person who gave us directions that it wasn't even the right exit we were on, and now, several years later, we're not exactly sure which exit we took that night. All I know is that I'm glad we chose to get out of there when we did. I don't want any part of whatever was going on that night. I've told quite a few people this story, and almost no one believes me. But it's definitely true, and is the freakiest thing that has ever happened to me. I had a few years where I was sort of down on my luck. I live in an area with a lot of relatives, so one of my aunts was having a party, and I ended up staying a lot later than I should have. There was free beer, so I had to, and I got a bit intoxicated. And when my cousin who was supposed to be driving me home wanted to leave, I declined because I wanted to keep drinking. So he left, and I was without a ride home. When I finally left, I had an extremely long and uncomfortable walk ahead of me. Whilst you might think that my aunt or someone else could have given me a lift home, my family was a little tired of having to drive me places. So I prepared for a really long walk down this country road. Although I had been drinking, the atmosphere outside sobered me up pretty quickly. It was really dark and very brisk. And for some strange reason, it was eerily quiet. I mean, usually there are all sorts of animal noises. You know, crickets and frogs and other things. But this night, everything was calm and quiet. I did become aware of some noises in the woods though. You know, as if an animal were walking back there. And the noises didn't go away either, which made me start to think that an animal might be following me. Of course, I was very nervous at this point. I didn't fancy being something's midnight snack, and I tried to hurry up a little bit, and I did get slightly ahead of the noises, so I figured that I'd be okay. However, right then, I heard a sound of several twigs breaking, but the sound stopped there. I had a feeling that whatever had been following me was now directly behind me, but it wasn't moving. I told myself to keep walking, but part of me said I just had to turn around and see. So very slowly, I forced myself to turn around, and when I saw my pursuer, I screamed. There was this large, dark figure standing behind me, and it had to be nearly 8 feet tall. The worst part, though, was that it had red, glowing eyes, and it stood there staring down at me. Well, I took off running right away, and I was so terrified that I didn't even notice if it was following me. I didn't know how far I actually ran, and if it followed me at all. But finally, after an eternity, I ventured a look back and saw nothing. It was still eerily quiet, and I was terrified, but I walked the rest of the way home. Now, I know everyone would just tell me that I was drunk and imagined it, but never before has drinking beer caused me to hallucinate. I know what I saw that night, and I never went for a walk in the middle of nowhere again. I had to attend a family reunion a few years ago. Unfortunately, I really didn't have the money to fly, nor the money to stay in a hotel on the way. So my plan was to drive the entire way and sleep at rest areas in my car. It made sense to me, as it would ensure that I would be able to visit my relatives. It was a 3-day trip, so I would be sleeping in the car for at least 2 nights. I brought along some pillows and blankets so that I could curl up in the back seat. The first night came and went with no incident. I found a rest area and was able to just hang out in the parking lot. The second day of driving, however, had me going through the mountains. I had never made this trip before, so I wasn't sure if I would find a rest area. I drove for a very long time, and when my eyes were beginning to close, I figured I would just have to pull out on the side of the road to get a little rest. It was much harder to go to sleep this time, but at least it was quiet and dark. Very few cars actually came across. I'm not really sure how long I had been asleep for before I felt something wake me up. I thought my car had moved a bit, but then I assumed it was probably just something I felt when I was sleeping. I closed my eyes, and then I felt it again. My car bobbed up and down a bit. I was afraid. Peeking out from under the blankets, I caught sight of someone standing at the front of my car. He had his foot resting on the bumper, and it was he who was pushing it down with his foot, causing my car to bob. I was about to hide back under the blankets when I looked to the side window and saw a second person there peeking into the side window. I jumped, and when I did, I saw the first guy leave the front of the car and come around to the side window where I was. He viciously tried opening my door, which fortunately was locked, and then started banging on my window. I was completely freaked at this point and decided that the best thing to do would be get into the front seat and start to drive. Right before I started the car though, the first guy succeeded in busting in my window. I yelled, but then quickly pulled away. I have no clue why those guys were antagonizing me, but I did not stop driving until I got to the reunion, and I have never slept in my car again. Bonus story. Driving in the backwoods of northern Georgia heading home. The moon was out, but this country-ass road had no streetlights, so basically my headlights are it. I can see silhouettes of things on the side of the road ahead of me. And then this massive shape comes out from behind a tree and begins squirming along the side of the road up ahead. I slow down and ponder if I want to go forward anymore, because while I had no idea what it was, I do know it was large and looks about as tall as my car and just as long. I thought I saw spikes on its back and moving weirdly. I decide screw it and began slowly going forward. I'm in a car. It can handle anything the state of Georgia can throw at me. Getting closer to the thing, I notice that it's undulating funny. I turn ever so slightly to hit it with my headlights, and it was a deer trying to hump another deer, and I guess not quite getting there. I didn't stop laughing until I got home, because I was sure for a moment that I was going to be attacked by some ancient unspeakable demon. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. These are some of my favourites, and if you'd like more middle of nowhere stories soon, be sure to smash that like button and subscribe, as you won't want to miss what I have in store for you next. I'm still trying to work my way through your recommendations, but by all means, if you have one, be sure to drop it in the comments section for a future topic and I'll try and get on it. Remember that you could submit your scary or paranormal stories to my new official Reddit page, or send it over to my email, which you can find in the description. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram and Twitter for updates behind the scenes and stuff like that. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.